Valentine's Day, the day of love, a day celebrated by couples, loved ones, and families across America, where chocolate hearts, flowers, and candles fill the air with romance. But in the small, quiet town of Clearwater, Florida, a tragedy unfolded that would forever mark this day as a symbol of betrayal, vengeance, and death. Detective Emily Turner had been working in law enforcement for over 15 years. She had seen her fair share of violent crime scenes, but nothing could have prepared her for what she encountered when she received the 911 call. The call came in just after 10:30 p.m. The dispatcher reported a shooting at a private residence on Clearwater Beach. The suspect, a woman named Sarah Barnes, a local cop with the Clearwater Police Department. The victim, her husband, Michael Barnes, a 42-year-old lawyer. The scene described was chilling. Michael had been shot 15 times. Upon arrival at the scene, Detective Turner was greeted by flashing blue and red lights, an array of police cars, and yellow tape that cordoned off the area. The night was eerily quiet, save for the low murmur of officers and the occasional distant sound of waves crashing on the shore. Sarah Barnes was sitting on the front porch, her hands cuffed behind her back, looking disoriented but calm, as though she had already accepted what had transpired. Inside the house, Michael's lifeless body was sprawled on the floor in the living room, blood pooling around him in a grotesque display. He had been shot multiple times in the chest, arms, and legs, with a final fatal shot to the head. The murder weapon, a service Glock, lay discarded on the floor next to him. "What happened?" Detective Turner asked, approaching Sarah. I, I didn't mean to. I didn't know what else to do," Sarah replied, her voice shaky but not hysterical. Sarah's eyes were vacant, her lips trembling as she stared at the ground. She wasn't sobbing, but her face was pale, drained of emotion. It wasn't the reaction Turner expected from someone who had just killed their spouse. "What happened, Sarah?" Turner repeated, her tone more urgent. "I caught him," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I caught him in the worst possible way, with our son." Turner's heart sank. It wasn't just a murder, it was something far more twisted. Sarah explained that, on that particular night, she had come home early from a routine shift at the station, wanting to surprise Michael with a romantic dinner. When she walked into their home, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The door to their bedroom was ajar. She had quietly walked inside, only to find Michael and their 14-year-old son, Lucas, in a compromising situation. Her breath caught in her throat as she described the scene. Her husband was half-dressed, his hands on their son, in ways that no father should ever touch his child. Sarah couldn't process what she was seeing. Anger surged through her, followed by a wave of cold, unrelenting rage. And then she did the unthinkable. She ran to her duty belt, grabbed her service weapon, and shot Michael once, twice, 3 times, until the gun ran dry. She reloaded and kept firing until there were no more bullets left in the clip. Turner's mind raced as she processed the horrifying details. What Sarah had confessed was shocking, but there were questions that needed answers. Why had she killed him? Was it a crime of passion, or was there more to the story? Turner took a deep breath, looking at the scene before her. The evidence was clear. Michael Barnes had been murdered. But something about this case felt off. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't add up. The next few days would reveal secrets that no one could have foreseen. And Detective Turner, seasoned and methodical, would stop at nothing to uncover the truth behind Sarah Barnes's shocking confession. But in order to understand why a cop would kill her husband, she had to first understand the twisted web of deceit and betrayal that had been carefully hidden from the outside world. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Clearwater as Detective Emily Turner stood outside the Barnes house, her mind racing with the details of the previous night. The scene she had just witnessed, with Sarah Barnes sitting calmly on the porch, still haunted her. It wasn't that she was stone cold or emotionless. It was the look of someone trapped in a nightmare, yet somehow detached from the gravity of the situation. Sarah's confession had been as chilling as it was cryptic. As Turner stepped inside the house, the evidence of the crime remained stark. Michael's body had been removed, but the bloodstains still lingered on the wooden floor, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place. The smell of iron was heavy in the air, and the once beautiful home now seemed cold and desolate. Turner couldn't help but wonder about the years of life that had been lived in this space. The family meals, the laughter, the memories, now all tainted by one act of unspeakable violence. She walked through the house with an air of quiet determination, taking in every detail. The living room where Michael had been found was clean and well kept, with photographs of Sarah, Michael, and their son scattered across the walls. There was a picture of Lucas's first day of school, another of the family on a beach vacation, and a more recent one, taken just a few months ago at a local park. The family appeared to be normal, at least from the outside. No one could have guessed that there was something darker simmering beneath the surface. The question on Turner's mind was simple. Why had Sarah killed her husband? And why in such a brutal manner? Turner knew she couldn't rely solely on Sarah's confession. She needed to dig deeper, into the dynamics of the Barnes family, into their relationships, and into the secrets they had kept hidden. Her first step was to interview Sarah, who was still being held at the Clearwater Police Department. The officers had given her some time to calm down, but Turner knew that wasn't going to make the conversation easier. People like Sarah Barnes, trained to be calm and collected under pressure, often hid their emotions in ways that made them difficult to read. Sarah's profession as a cop could have made her more resilient in the face of tragedy, but it also meant she knew exactly how to manipulate the situation. When Turner entered the interrogation room, Sarah was sitting quietly at the table, her hands folded in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but she didn't look frantic or guilty. She just looked exhausted. "Sarah," Turner began, sitting down across from her, "I know this is difficult, but I need to understand what happened that night." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the table. "I already told you everything. I walked in. I saw him with Lucas. I had to stop him. I didn't know what else to do." Turner leaned in slightly, her tone soft but insistent. "You said you caught him with your son. What exactly did you see, Sarah?" There was a long pause. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I saw him," Sarah's voice faltered. "He was touching him in ways no father should ever touch their child. It's hard to say it out loud. It's hard to even believe it's real. But I had to do something." Turner's stomach turned at the thought. It was a parent's worst nightmare to have to confront something like this. But Turner needed more than Sarah's emotional response. She needed facts. She needed to understand if this was truly what Sarah had witnessed, or if there was more to the story. "Sarah," Turner said, her voice firm but compassionate, "I need you to tell me everything. You say you caught him. Was there anything about that night that felt different? Anything that seemed off?" Sarah sat back in her chair, her face a mix of confusion and despair. I I don't know. I don't think so. I thought maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. But then I saw the look in his eyes. He was like he didn't even care that I was there. He didn't even try to stop me from seeing. And then I lost control." Turner could sense the raw emotion in Sarah's words, but there was something unsettling about the way she spoke, almost as if she were trying to convince herself that what had happened was justified. "After you shot him," Turner continued, "did you see Lucas after? Where was he?" Sarah shook her head. I didn't see him. I didn't even think about him. I was in a rage. I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. It wasn't until later that I realized what I'd done." Turner nodded, taking a mental note of Sarah's responses. There was one thing she couldn't ignore: the lack of remorse, or at least the appearance of it. Sarah's emotions were undeniably real, but was she truly the victim she claimed to be? Or was there something else at play here? "I'm going to need to speak to your son," Turner said, her voice steady. "Lucas needs to be part of this investigation." Sarah's eyes widened in fear. Please. He doesn't need to be involved in this. He's been through enough. Don't drag him into this nightmare." "I'm afraid I have no choice," Turner replied, her tone unyielding. "For his sake, I have to understand what happened that night. The truth will come out, one way or another." As Turner left the interrogation room, She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The pieces didn't fit. Sarah's account was tragic, but it didn't feel complete. Was this really a crime of passion, or had Sarah been hiding something deeper? And what about Lucas? Was he really the innocent victim of a monstrous act? Or was there more to his relationship with his father than anyone realized? Turner knew that to uncover the truth, she needed to speak to Lucas. But as the hours passed and her investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. This case was far from simple. There were too many unanswered questions and too many hidden layers waiting to be peeled back. The investigation was just beginning. The following day was overcast, a thin mist hanging in the air as Detective Turner stood outside the Clearwater Police Department. The building, normally a place of order and structure, now felt chaotic in the wake of the tragic event that had unfolded. While the investigators had gathered all the evidence they could from the crime scene, the true story, why Sarah Barnes had killed her husband, Michael, was far from clear. Her next step was critical, speaking with Lucas Barnes, the 14-year-old boy who had been at the center of his father's tragic death. The young boy was the only other living person who knew exactly what had happened that night. But his involvement in this case was not just crucial, it was also delicate. Turner knew the trauma Lucas had likely experienced was immense, and the last thing she wanted to do was push him too hard, too fast. Lucas had been taken to the local hospital after the shooting, reportedly shaken and confused, but physically unharmed. His mother, Sarah, had insisted that he be kept away from the media and from the police as much as possible. But after Sarah's confession, Turner had little choice but to speak to the boy. The truth was buried in Lucas's account of the night, and Turner needed it to move forward with the case. As she entered the small room where Lucas was waiting, she took a moment to adjust herself. The boy was sitting on a bed, fidgeting nervously with the hem of his t-shirt. His face was pale, and his wide brown eyes had a glazed, haunted look about them. He seemed far too young to be caught in the middle of something so monstrous. "Lucas?" Turner asked gently, taking a seat across from him. "I'm Detective Turner. I know this must be hard for you, but I need to ask you about what happened on Valentine's night. It's important for us to understand what took place." The boy's eyes darted around the room, as if he were searching for an escape, though he knew there was none. He swallowed hard, nodding slightly, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "I don't want to talk about it," he whispered, looking down at his hands. Turner's heart ached. She didn't want to force him into a conversation he wasn't ready for, but she needed the truth. She leaned forward, her voice as soft as she could make it. "Lucas, I understand that you're scared, but you're not in trouble. No one thinks you're to blame for what happened. I just need to know what you saw that night. If you can tell me, it might help us understand everything better. Can you do that for me?" The boy's shoulders slumped as he let out a deep sigh, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Turner didn't rush him, allowing him to gather his thoughts. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he began, his hands trembling. I didn't know it would be like this." Turner remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. I was confused. I don't know how to explain it. My dad, he'd been acting weird for a while, and I thought maybe it was just me. I thought maybe I was doing something wrong. He'd always tell me to come to his office for talks, and it didn't feel right. I didn't know what to do." Lucas paused, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. Turner's heart sank as she realized the depth of the boy's turmoil. "Did your father do something to you, Lucas?" she asked carefully, though she already suspected the answer. Lucas's face crumpled, his voice barely a whisper. He touched me. It wasn't like anything I've ever known. I didn't want it. I didn't know how to stop it." Turner's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "Did your mom know about this?" Lucas shook his head violently. "No, I didn't want her to know. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want to make everything worse." Tears streamed down his face now, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Turner felt a wave of sympathy, but there was no time to grieve for the boy. She had to stay focused. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't the whole truth. Lucas had been a victim, But now the question was whether Sarah had truly known about what had been happening, or whether the pain of that realization had driven her to kill her husband. Lucas, Turner said softly, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you something else. When you were in the room that night, did you see your mom? Did she, did she see what was happening? Lucas looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and guilt. I don't know. I don't know if she saw anything. I was trying to get away, but then she came in and she started yelling. I heard her shouting at Dad, and then she just shot him. She just kept shooting him. Turner closed her eyes for a moment, processing what Lucas had said. It was as she suspected. Sarah had not only found out about her husband's betrayal, but she had acted on that knowledge in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The shooting wasn't just the result of a crime of passion. It was the culmination of years of pain, deceit, and broken trust. Lucas, Turner continued, I need to ask you one more thing. After everything happened, did your mom say anything to you? Was there anything she said that might help us understand why she did what she did? Lucas hesitated for a moment before speaking. She just kept saying that she had to protect me, that she didn't want anyone to hurt me. She told me it wasn't my fault and that she'd do anything to keep me safe. Turner nodded slowly, filing away Lucas's words in her mind. She knew she needed to speak to Sarah again, but now there was a new layer to the case, a mother's desperate need to protect her child, no matter the cost. But the real question remained, had Sarah Barnes been justified in her actions, or had she crossed a line that could never be undone? As Turner left the room, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The investigation was becoming more complex with every new revelation. Sarah's violent outburst had been spurred by a terrible betrayal, but there were still too many unanswered questions. What had driven Michael to act in such a way? How long had this abuse been going on? And most importantly, was Sarah truly guilty of murder? Or was she a victim of circumstances beyond her control? The answers lay hidden in the twists and turns of this case, and Turner would stop at nothing to uncover them. Detective Turner sat in her car, the engine idling as the rain began to pour down on Clearwater. The once serene town now felt like a place caught in a storm, both literally and figuratively. The truth about Michael Barnes's betrayal had shaken the very core of everything Turner had believed about the case. Sarah, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, had murdered her husband after discovering the horrific truth about his abuse of their son, Lucas. But that was only one part of the story. The deeper Turner dug, the murkier everything became. There was still something that didn't add up. Michael Barnes had been a successful lawyer, a respected member of the community, but the abuse that Lucas had described seemed out of character for someone with so much to lose. How long had Michael been hiding his dark secrets? And had Sarah known about it before that night? Or had it all come as a sudden shock? Turner needed to know more about Michael's past, and so she made her way to the Clearwater courthouse, hoping to uncover something, anything that might shed light on the man Sarah had married, the man Lucas had called father. Inside the courthouse, Turner met with a few of Michael's former colleagues, including his close friend Dan Reynolds, a fellow lawyer who had worked with Michael for over a decade. Dan was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face worn with the years of hard work and personal losses. He seemed genuinely surprised when Turner approached him with questions about Michael. "You're here to talk about Mike?" Dan asked, his brows furrowed. "I don't know what to say. I mean, Mike was a good guy, always on top of his game, always reliable." Turner leaned forward. "You've known him for a long time. Did he ever seem off to you? Anything about him that seemed different? Maybe something that didn't add up?" Dan looked uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Off? I don't know. Mike was complicated. He had a side to him, sure. But who doesn't? Everybody's got their skeletons, right?" Turner narrowed her eyes. "Did you know anything about his relationship with his son? Any signs of trouble?" Dan hesitated. "Listen, I can't speak for his home life. Mike didn't talk much about that. But I will tell you this. Mike's always been private about his family. He loves Sarah, though. Everyone knew that. But Lucas? I don't know. Mike wasn't exactly the father of the year. Turner's curiosity piqued. What do you mean by that? Dan paused, clearly uncomfortable. But after a long silence, he spoke. There were rumors, Detective. Nothing concrete, just whispers. A few months ago, I heard from a mutual friend that Mike was struggling, financially, emotionally. There were some talks about his marriage being on the rocks. People said he was having issues with his temper. But as far as anything like abuse, I can't say. That's a whole different level. Was he seeing anyone outside his marriage? Turner pressed. Dan shook his head. Not that I know of, but there were some nights when Mike seemed distracted. He'd go home early, but not to work. And he'd leave with this look on his face like he was running from something. It was strange, but I didn't push it. It wasn't my business. Turner jotted down notes in her pad. Thanks, Dan. Anything else you can think of? Even something small could help. Dan rubbed his chin. Actually, now that you mention it, there was one thing. A few weeks before the incident, Mike seemed to be under a lot of pressure. More than usual. I overheard him talking to Sarah on the phone, and he was apologizing for something. He kept saying he was sorry. He said, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. Please don't leave me. It was a private call, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. Turner's mind raced. Was it possible that Michael had confessed to something? Something so terrible that Sarah had decided to take matters into her own hands? She thanked Dan and left the courthouse, her mind now fixated on the idea that Michael's financial and emotional struggles might have played a key role in his actions. But there was more to uncover. Turner knew she needed to look into the Barnes' financial records to see if there was any connection between Michael's alleged financial troubles and his relationship with his son. If there was one thing she had learned in her years of investigation, it was that the truth often lay hidden in the most unlikely of places. Back at the police station, Turner began poring over the records. She found a few things that were worth noting. Michael had recently taken out several large loans, which, given his stable career, seemed odd. He was living beyond his means, according to his bank statements. But what stood out the most was a large payment made to an unknown account. The transaction had been labeled simply as settlement. The payment had been made just weeks before the murder. Turner's instincts told her that this was no coincidence. She dug deeper, contacting the bank and requesting more information about the transaction. What she found next would be the key that unlocked everything. The payment had been made to an account in the name of one of Michael's old clients, a woman who had filed a civil lawsuit against him years earlier. Her name was Hannah Monroe, a woman with a history of accusations of fraud. Hannah had sued Michael for breach of contract and had claimed he had been responsible for a series of bad legal decisions that cost her a substantial amount of money. But after a settlement was reached, the case had disappeared from public view. The payment, Turner discovered, was part of an arrangement to keep the matter quiet. But what was the connection to Lucas? Turner needed to find out more about this mysterious woman and the role she had played in Michael's life, and whether she had anything to do with the events leading up to the murder. As Turner worked tirelessly to connect the dots, she found herself grappling with a growing sense of unease. It was becoming clearer that Michael had been hiding a number of secrets, not just from Sarah, but from everyone. And those secrets, it seemed, had caught up with him in the most tragic way imaginable. There was still so much to learn, and with every piece of information, the case was becoming even more complicated. But Turner was determined to get to the bottom of it. She was closing in on the truth, and she wouldn't stop until she uncovered every dark corner of Michael Barnes' life. The rain had stopped, but the humidity lingered as a Detective Turner sat in her office, staring at the files scattered across her desk. Everything seemed to be falling into place, but there was still something nagging at the back of her mind. The settlement payment to Hannah Monroe, Michael's hidden financial troubles, and Lucas's disturbing account of what had happened on the night of the murder. It all pointed to a deeper, darker story. Turner's phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was her partner, Detective Callahan, his voice steady but urgent. Turner, I've got something. You're going to want to hear this. Go ahead, she said, leaning forward in her chair, bracing herself for what was to come. I tracked down Hannah Monroe, Callahan continued. She's got a history, not just with Michael, but with a few other men in the past. She's been involved in multiple lawsuits, most of them settlements. But it gets worse. She was married to a man named Gary Monroe. Turner's eyes narrowed. What's the connection to Michael? Well, Callahan hesitated. Gary Monroe was a former colleague of Michael's. They worked together back in the early 2000s, both in the same law firm. But Gary was let go under strange circumstances. It's not public knowledge, but I dug up an old report. Apparently, Gary was accused of having inappropriate relationships with clients, multiple clients. Turner's stomach churned. She had suspected that Michael's connections and hidden relationships were tied to something bigger, but she hadn't anticipated this. So, you're saying Michael and Gary were involved in the same kind of scandal? It looks that way, Callahan confirmed. But here's the real kicker. Michael and Gary's downfall was both tied to their involvement with a certain type of client, Hannah Monroe. She had filed complaints against Gary before Michael took over the case and eventually settled it for her. Turns out Gary and Michael were both more involved with her than anyone knew. It's starting to look like more than just a legal dispute. I'm wondering if there was a much deeper, personal connection. Turner's mind was racing. This new information was disturbing, and it painted Michael in a far more sinister light. It seemed that Michael and Gary had been more than just colleagues. They were both implicated in the same pattern of behavior, exploiting vulnerable women. But where did Lucas fit into this mess? Had Michael been involved with other victims beyond Hannah Monroe? And why had Sarah not realized the extent of the darkness in her husband's life until it was too late? We need to talk to Hannah Monroe, Turner said decisively. We've got to find out what else she knows. Maybe she can connect the dots between Michael's abuse, Gary's involvement, and whatever role she played in all of this. I'm on it, Callahan replied, already moving forward with the task. Later that afternoon, Turner and Callahan arrived at a modest two-story house on the outskirts of Clearwater, where Hannah Monroe now lived. The woman had become reclusive over the years, a shadow of the confident person she had once been. When Turner rang the doorbell, it took several long minutes before the door creaked open. Hannah Monroe stood in the doorway, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. She looked older than her late 30s, her face lined with worry and regret. Her hair was messy, and she wore a worn-out robe that hung loosely around her frame. "Detective Turner," she said, her voice a whisper, "what do you want?" "We're here to ask you about your connection to Michael Barnes," Turner replied, "and his involvement with Gary Monroe. We need to know everything you can tell us." Hannah hesitated, her eyes flickering with something, fear, guilt, or maybe a bit of both. "I don't have anything to say about Gary. That's in the past." Turner stepped closer, keeping her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about Gary. Michael Barnes is dead. His wife killed him, and we need to know why. We believe you might know more than you're telling us." Hannah stiffened, her face paling as the weight of the situation set in. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "You have to tell us, Hannah," Turner pressed. "You were part of this story. You can't keep hiding the truth." After a long pause, Hannah finally spoke, her voice low and tremulous. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. But it's too late now, isn't it? You'll never understand what happened. I didn't want to be a part of all this. But Michael got too deep into it all. He was just like Gary. Just like him." Turner's heart raced. "What do you mean? How were they alike?" Hannah's eyes glazed over as she began to unravel the tangled history. Gary was abusive, and so was Michael. But Michael had his own way of hiding it. When he first took over my case, he was professional. Too professional. I was just a client, but he made it clear that he wanted more from me. He made promises, told me he'd help me out of my mess if I'd give him what he wanted in return. But I wasn't that kind of woman. I refused. I tried to keep my distance. "But he didn't let go, did he?" Turner asked. Hannah shook her head. "Number. He pushed harder. He manipulated me, said that I was ruining his career. He played on my vulnerabilities, my fear of being labeled a fraud. I ended up agreeing to his terms. He wanted something more than just the case, and I was too weak to refuse. It was horrible, Detective. I was scared and I felt trapped. But Michael, he was different from Gary. He was smart. He knew how to hide it. He knew how to make people believe he was a good guy." Turner's mind reeled. She had suspected Michael's involvement with Hannah Monroe, but hearing her words confirmed the extent of his manipulative nature. He hadn't just abused his son, he had exploited and manipulated women to get what he wanted. He had learned from the mistakes of his old mentor, Gary Monroe, and refined the practice until it was almost undetectable. "Did Michael ever hurt you?" Turner asked, bracing herself for the answer. Hannah took a deep breath, tears welling in her eyes. "No, not physically, but mentally. Yes, he ruined me. I thought I was the only one, but now with everything that's happened with Sarah, I see it all. I wasn't the only victim." Turner took out her notebook, jotting down everything she had learned. "You're telling me Michael did the same thing to his own son?" Hannah's face twisted in anguish. "I never wanted to think it, but after all that's come out, it makes sense. The way he used to look at Lucas, it wasn't right. I wish I'd said something sooner, but I was too afraid." Turner's blood ran cold as she processed this information. Michael Barnes had been a predator, someone who had hidden his true nature beneath a mask of respectability. He had destroyed the lives of those closest to him, including his own son. Sarah's rage that night hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been a culmination of years of betrayal, deceit, and manipulation. And now it seemed that she had taken matters into her own hands, believing that she could protect Lucas from the monster that her husband had become. But was it murder, or was it self-defense? Turner didn't know the answer yet, but she was closer than ever to uncovering the full truth. Detective Turner couldn't shake the image of Sarah Barnes standing over her husband's lifeless body in their kitchen, the gun still smoking in her hand. It had been an act of rage, yes, but had it been an act of self-defense, a desperate attempt to protect her son from a man who had tormented them both for years? Or had it been cold-blooded murder, fueled by years of resentment in the discovery of a long-hidden betrayal? The more Turner thought about it, the more she realized that they were now dealing with two stories. One of a woman who had been pushed to the brink of her tolerance, and another of a man who had carefully crafted a life of deceit, manipulation, and abuse. In Sarah's eyes, it was clear that she believed she had been fighting for Lucas's safety, fighting to stop the cycle of abuse that Michael had perpetuated. But Turner still needed more answers. She sat at her desk, the case files sprawled out before her, staring at the photographs from the crime scene. Michael's body slumped against the refrigerator, a bloody mess from the 15 shots fired. Sarah had claimed that she found him in the act, that it was the final straw after years of emotional and physical torment. But something about the narrative still felt incomplete. Turner knew that if she was going to get to the bottom of this, she needed to confront Sarah directly. She couldn't rely on the statements from the witnesses or even the physical evidence. This case required the truth to come from Sarah herself. But the question was, would Sarah finally admit to what she had done, or would she continue to hide behind her version of events? It wasn't long before Turner found herself standing in front of Sarah Barnes's house, her heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment of truth. Sarah had already been questioned once, but the detectives had only scratched the surface. Now it was Turner's turn. She rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, Sarah appeared at the door. She looked different, haggard, tired, as if the weight of what had happened was slowly starting to sink in. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her hair was disheveled, but there was a certain defiance in her posture. She wasn't going to give up easily. "Detective Turner," Sarah said, her voice flat, "I've already told you everything. I don't have anything more to say." Turner kept her voice calm but firm. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. We're not just looking for a confession. We're looking for the truth. I know you're hurting, but it's time to be honest about what happened that night." Sarah stepped back, pulling the door open a little wider. "What more is there to say? I found him with Lucas. I shot him. End of story." Turner shook her head. "No, Sarah, that's not the end. We've uncovered some things about your husband, things that you may not have known, or maybe you did, but were too afraid to admit. I want you to think carefully. What if what you think happened that night isn't the whole truth? What if your anger, your pain, clouded your judgment?" Sarah's face hardened, but Turner could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had touched a nerve. Turner pressed on. I spoke with Hannah Monroe. She told me everything. How Michael had manipulated her, how he had been just like Gary, how he used his position of power to prey on vulnerable women. And Lucas, he wasn't the only one he hurt. For a brief moment, Sarah seemed to lose her composure. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. Turner could see the emotional struggle in her eyes. He was, he was a monster, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know how far it had gone. I didn't know the full extent of it until that night. But when I walked into that kitchen and saw him with Lucas, I snapped. I couldn't let him hurt him anymore. Turner's heart ached for Sarah, but she knew that the truth was complicated. Sarah had believed she was acting out of love and protection for her son, but was that enough to justify the murder of her husband? Was it an act of justice or something darker? Tell me, Sarah, Turner said softly, her voice steady. When you fired those shots, what did you think was going to happen? Did you think you were saving Lucas, or did you just want to end the pain? Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't break her gaze. I thought I was saving him. I had to stop him. He wasn't going to stop. I couldn't let him destroy my son. Turner nodded, understanding the agony in Sarah's voice. But this wasn't just about a mother protecting her child. There was something else at play here, a deeper layer of manipulation and deceit, and Turner was determined to uncover it. I'm going to ask you one more time, Sarah, Turner said. Was there anything else you didn't tell us? Anything you're still holding back? Sarah swallowed hard, her expression shifting from grief to guilt. I knew about the financial problems. Michael had been hiding it from me, but I found out. He was going under. Big time. But that wasn't what pushed me to do it. It was what he did to Lucas. What he was trying to do to him. Turner felt a chill creep down her spine as she pieced together the fragments of the story. Michael had been losing control, not just financially but personally. He had been a man living a double life, hiding his darker inclinations behind a veneer of respectability. But it wasn't just the abuse of Lucas that had led to his death. It was the culmination of years of betrayal, fear, and shattered trust. Sarah, I need to know, Turner pressed. Did Michael ever try to force himself on you? Did he try to do the same thing to you that he did to those women? For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak. She closed her eyes as if recalling the painful memories that she had tried to bury for so long. Finally, her voice came out in a barely audible whisper. Yes, he did. He tried. More than once. Turner's heart sank. This wasn't just about a broken marriage or a fight between husband and wife. This was about years of manipulation, control, and abuse. Some of it hiding in plain sight, some of it buried beneath layers of fear and silence. Michael Barnes had been a predator, not just in his professional life, but in his own home. Turner took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had everything she needed now. Sarah's confession, the evidence of Michael's abuse, and the twisted connection between him and his former colleague, Gary Monroe, all pointed to a story of terror and control that had gone on for far too long. Sarah had acted out of love for her son, but the law was clear. Her actions were still murder. The question now was whether her motive, her desperation to protect her child, would be enough to sway the court. Turner placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, offering her a small comfort. We'll do everything we can to make sure the truth comes out, but you have to be ready for what happens next. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the doorframe for support. The courtroom was a scene of somber tension. It had been weeks since Sarah Barnes had been arrested, and now she sat at the defendant's table, her eyes red-rimmed but determined, the weight of the trial pressing down on her every moment. She had been through so much, the shock of Michael's betrayal, the chaos of the murder, and now the public scrutiny. In her mind, she had done what any mother would do. She had protected her son, and in her heart, that was all that mattered. But now the law was about to weigh in on her actions, and there was no escaping the consequences of what she had done. Detective Turner sat near the back of the courtroom, observing intently. She had spent weeks piecing together the fragments of this case, but now the truth was laid bare in front of a jury. She had heard the story from Sarah, from witnesses, and even from Hannah Monroe. She knew what had happened in that house on Valentine's Day, but she also knew that the justice system wasn't always clear-cut. The question remained, was Sarah's act one of self-defense, or was it cold-blooded murder? Could a mother's love be enough to justify the taking of a life? The defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named James Carter, stood up and addressed the jury. His voice was calm but persuasive, carefully constructing a narrative that painted Sarah as a victim, not a villain. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Carter began, pacing slowly in front of them, "you have heard the details of this tragic event. A woman, a mother, caught in the most unimaginable of circumstances. Her husband, a man she trusted, had betrayed her and her son in the worst way possible. Michael Barnes was not just a cheating husband. He was a manipulator, a predator who preyed upon vulnerable women, and, most tragically, he had been abusing his own son. Sarah Barnes had no choice but to act. She did not kill out of malice. She killed out of fear, fear for her son's safety, fear for her own life, and fear that her husband's reign of terror would never end." Carter's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. He was good, damn good, at tugging at the jury's emotions. But Turner knew that emotions could cloud the truth. What Sarah had done was tragic, but was it justified? She had killed Michael Barnes in a moment of rage, and now the jury had to decide whether that rage was understandable or unforgivable. The prosecution, led by a stern and calculated prosecutor named Linda Williams, stood and approached the jury box. She was not here to win them over with sentimentality. She was here to present the hard facts of the case. "Mr. Carter is correct in one regard," Williams began, her voice cutting through the room. "This is a tragic situation. But what the defense fails to mention is the fact that Sarah Barnes was not just a victim. She was complicit in her husband's life for years. She knew what was happening in that house. She knew that her husband was abusive, both to her and to their son. She knew that Michael Barnes was a predator, but instead of confronting him, she allowed this twisted life to continue. She even went so far as to cover up for him." The room was silent as Williams turned and pointed to Sarah on the defendant's table. Sarah Barnes did not act out of fear for her son's life. She acted out of anger and revenge. Her husband's infidelity, his deceit, and the truth about his abuse did not suddenly reveal itself that night. It had been building for years. Sarah Barnes chose to take matters into her own hands, to kill her husband in a moment of rage. The law is clear, ladies and gentlemen. Murder is murder, no matter the motivation. Turner couldn't help but agree with the prosecutor. It was hard to ignore the fact that Sarah had been complicit in the life that Michael had created. She had chosen to stay, to remain in a marriage filled with secrets and lies. She had seen the warning signs, the subtle shifts in Michael's behavior, but she had never fully confronted him until that night. The courtroom proceedings continued, each side presenting their evidence, their witnesses, their theories. The defense painted Sarah as a desperate mother protecting her child, while the prosecution portrayed her as a woman who had allowed abuse to fester in silence, only to act when it suited her. Then it was Sarah's turn to speak. She took the stand, her hands trembling as she faced the jury, the weight of the moment settling upon her. The courtroom fell silent, every person in the room waiting for her to speak the words that would define her fate. "Mrs. Barnes," Prosecutor Williams said, her tone firm, "can you tell us why, after years of tolerating your husband's behavior, you decided to take matters into your own hands that night? What was it that made you pull the trigger?" Sarah swallowed hard, her voice shaky but resolute. "I didn't know what else to do," she said softly. "I loved him once. I loved him, but I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I found him with Lucas that night. I found him with my son. I knew what he was. I knew what he had been doing, and I couldn't let him hurt him anymore." Her voice cracked, but she continued, her eyes never leaving the jury. "I couldn't let him destroy Lucas like he destroyed me. I didn't know if I was going to live through that night, but I knew I couldn't let Michael live to hurt anyone else. So I shot him. I shot him because I had no other choice. He was a monster, and I couldn't let him take my son." There was a long pause as Sarah's words sank into the silence. Turner watched the jury, noting the shifts in their expressions. Some were moved, others were skeptical. The facts of the case, the abuse, the betrayal, and the murder had created a complex, tangled web of emotions. But now it was up to the jury to untangle it all. Hours later, the jury deliberated. Turner sat in her office, waiting for the final verdict. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what happened in that courtroom, this case would haunt her for a long time. The line between right and wrong had never been so blurry. She had also been a perpetrator. The jury filed back into the courtroom, and Turner stood with the rest of the spectators as the foreman stood to read the verdict. The room held its breath, and the moment seemed to stretch out for an eternity. "We, the jury," the foreman began, his voice steady, "find the defendant, Sarah Barnes, guilty of second-degree murder." The room erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in relief. Sarah sat still, her face blank, as she took in the verdict. Turner felt a knot tighten in her chest. It wasn't justice in its purest form, but it was a verdict that acknowledged both Sarah's actions and the unbearable circumstances that led to them. She had acted out of love, out of desperation, but it wasn't enough to absolve her of the crime she had committed. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, Turner couldn't help but feel the weight of the case settle deeper in her heart. The story was over for now, but the consequences of that one night would continue to ripple through the lives of everyone involved. Michael was dead, his secrets laid bare. Sarah would face years behind bars, and Lucas would carry the scars of that night for the rest of his life. And for Turner, she would never forget the look in Sarah's eyes when she spoke about protecting her son. It was a look that spoke of a woman pushed to the brink, a mother who had crossed the line between justice and vengeance. As the doors of the courtroom closed, Detective Turner walked out into the bright Florida sun, knowing that this case would never be as simple as it appeared. The truth was never black and white. It was always tangled, always complicated. And sometimes even the most heartbreaking of actions could come from the deepest love.